Welcome back, and today we're going to continue on with section 2 of chapter 3. And today we're going to talk about compound statements and connectives. Okay, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to talk about expressing compound statements in symbolic form, expressing symbolic statements with parentheses in English, and then using what we call the dominance of connectives. And this is going to be important when we get to truth tables. Okay. Simple statements convey one idea with no connecting words. So the sky is green, the grass is wet, Paris is located in France. Those are statements that convey one idea. Compound statements combine two or more simple statements using connectives. What are the connectives? Well, those are going to be and or, if, then. Those are examples of connectives. So they join simple statements. So and, or, if, then, if and only if, those are all different types of connectives. Now, if we use P and Q to represent simple statements, then we could use the compound statement P and Q, which is symbolized by using this upside down, this caret, this like upside down V. So this represents the compound statement P and Q. So I could say P could be the statement, I'm going to the movies. And Q could be the statement, I'm going to hang out with my friends. So P and Q says, I am going to go to the movies and I'm going to hang out with my friends. Okay, so that's an example of how we could take two logical statements and put them together with a connective and. Now, this is called a conjunction. So this is a conjunction or a conjunctive statement. Okay, so let P and Q represent the following simple statements. So P is, it is after 5 p.m. Q, they are working. So what we want to do is write each compound statement below in symbolic form. So here it says, it is after 5 p.m. and they're working. So how would we write this? Well, this statement is P. This statement is Q with the word and. So it's going to be P upside down V Q. Okay. So see how we just translated statement by statement with the connective. Okay. Here it says it is after 5 p.m. and they're not working. Well, if Q is they are working, what is they are not working? Well, it'd be the tilde Q, it'd be the negation. So if we put all this together, this is what we come up with. So here's the symbolic form. So these are the different types. We have P and Q, so these are all P and Q. Here's how we could state it. We could use and. But is also used in English for and. I'm going to go to the store, but I'm not going to buy milk. So that would be the same as I'm going to the store and I'm not going to buy milk. Okay. P yet Q. Okay. I'm going to the store yet I'm not going to buy milk. Same thing as and. So these three connectives are the same as and nevertheless. P, nevertheless, Q. Okay. Here's an example using these two phrases. It is after 5 p.m. and they are working. It is after 5 p.m. but they are not working. It is after 5 p.m. yet they are not working. Or it is after 5 p.m. nevertheless they are working. Okay, So all four of these phrases in English are translated in the same way as a conjunction. Now, the connective or can mean two different things. Okay, so we can consider the statement, I visited London or Paris. Now, this statement could mean exclusive or. I visited London or Paris, but not both. It could also mean inclusive or. I visited London or Paris or both. Now, in logic, it is always used with the inclusive or. Okay, disjunction is a compound statement formed using the inclusive or represented by the V. Okay, so this is or. So P or Q or both is symbolized as P with the little V Q. Okay, so this includes the possibility of both being true. So either P or Q or both. So now let's use P and Q as these statements. So let P represent the bill receives majority approval. Q, the bill becomes a law. Write each compound statement below in symbolic form. So here it says the bill receives majority approval or the bill becomes a law. Now in the first statement, this is what? This is P. And then we have the connective or, and then the second statement is what? Q. And so we get P or Q. Now the second one here says the bill receives majority approval or the bill does not become a law. So in this case here, we now have the negation of the second one. And so we get P or not Q. Okay, and this would be the way we would write it symbolically. So now, what about if-then statements? These are what we call implications or conditionals. So the diagram shows a relationship that can be expressed three ways. So here's the writers and poets example. This is saying all poets are writers. That's one way of saying it. We could also say there are no poets that are not writers. Right? So we've seen those two ways before. Or we could say if a person is a poet, which means that they're inside the circle, then that person must also be a writer. So we can use an implication or a conditional. If the person is a poet, which means in here, then they're also inside the circle of writers, so they must be also a writer. So if a person is a poet, then that person is also a writer. Okay? So those three statements mean the same thing. Now the compound statement if P then Q is symbolized with the arrow. So if P implies Q, or if P then Q. So we have this arrow that says, hey, if P is true, then Q must be true. This is called a conditional statement or an implication. So the statement that comes before the arrow is called the antecedent. The statement after the arrow is called the consequent. So it's the antecedent implies the consequent. Okay, or the consequent follows from the antecedent. Now, if we let P and Q represent the following statements. So P represents a person is a father, Q, a person is a male. Then we can write each of the compound statements below in symbolic form. So it says here, if a person is a father, then the person is a male. Okay, so this case here is if what? What's the if part? If part is the antecedent. So that's going to be P. So P implies what? Q. So the if part is the antecedent. The then part is the consequent. Okay, so here's P. So if P, then Q. And so we say P implies Q. Okay, now What about, oops, did I miss one? Oh, I guess it jumped to C. Okay. So it says here, if a person is not a male, then the person is not a father. So if a person is not a male, then that person is not a father. So this would say not male. So this says a person is a male. So if a person is not a male, then that would be not Q. So not Q, if not Q, then not what? Not P. And so we would say not Q implies not P, and we would write it in this symbolic form. Now, here's a helpful table. So there's lots of different ways of saying an implication, okay? And there's lots of English statements that mean an implication. They mean the same thing, but they're said several different ways. You could say if P then Q. That's used all the time in English. If you do your homework, then you can have some ice cream. Or if you get 100% on your spelling test, I will take you to the movies, okay? Or you could say Q if P. You could switch it around. Say, okay, I'll take you to the movies if you get 100% on your spelling test, right? That's the same. Now, P is sufficient for Q. We say is P is a sufficient condition for Q, okay? So in this case here, we're saying, hey, P is sufficient for being a male, which means if you're a father, then it's sufficient for being a male. But if I say Q is necessary for P, which means that in order to be a father, I have to first be a male, right? So what we say, Q is the necessary condition. So Q is necessary for P, which means it is necessary, what? To be male in order to even have the possibility of being a father, okay? Whereas it's sufficient to be a father for being a male. Okay, see the subtle difference there? Okay. Now, P only if Q. This means P only if Q means the same thing. Okay? Or I could say only if Q implies P. So I can switch these around. Again, English, you can say it a lot of different ways. Okay? And so make sure you understand these different ways of saying it, but all of these English statements, these phrases, all mean the same thing, a conditional. Now, what about the if and only if statements? Okay, that one is an English statement, but that's slightly different. If and only if, so let's go back. If P then Q. So if P then Q. But then we have this P only if Q. Right? Well, if we take those two statements together, it goes both directions. If and only if. Okay? So this is what we call the biconditional. Biconditional statements are conditional statements that are true if the statement is still true when the antecedent and the consequent are reversed. In other words, the conditional goes both directions. Okay? If one side is true, the other side has to be true. Okay? If a person is a father, then that person is a male. Okay? But if a person is a male, then the person is a father is not necessarily true. This is necessarily true. This is not necessarily true. You can be a male and not be a father, right? If a person is an unmarried male, then the person is a bachelor. That's true by definition. If a person is a bachelor, then that person is an unmarried male. That is also true. Okay, so this is biconditional, means that it goes both ways. Okay, so we say P if and only if Q. So we say only if Q, right? So let's put it back here. It says only if Q, P only if Q, right? So P if and only if Q. So here's the if, right? P if Q, right? This is Q if P. That's what this means. But what if I put P if Q? That means Q implies P. So P if Q is Q implies P. But only if P only if Q means P implies Q. So that if you put it together, you get the double arrow. So it means it goes both ways. It's a biconditional. It goes both directions. And the abbreviation is IFF, if and only if. Okay, so now here are some more symbols here. So a negation, if we put it all together, not P, then we got a conjunction, which is symbolized this way. And it can be, again, phrased different ways. Disjunction, which is the or statement. We've got conditional, which is P arrow Q, or P implies Q. And then we have the biconditional, which means it goes both ways, if and only if. Or we could say P is necessary and sufficient for Q. Now, let P and Q represent the following simple statements. She is wealthy and she is happy. We want to write each of the following symbolic forms in words. So what does this mean? Well, we start with the inside, right? So this means P and Q, right? She is wealthy and she is happy. But then we get this negation out here. So we would say it is not the case, or it is not true that she is both wealthy and happy. Or it is not the case, or it is not true that she is wealthy and she is happy. Okay. What about this one? This says not P and Q. Now there's no parentheses. So it's not P and Q. Well, what is not P? She is not wealthy. So this is saying she is not wealthy and she is happy. Now, what about this one? This is P or Q and then the negation of that thing. So it says she is happy or she is wealthy or she is happy. So it's not the case that she is wealthy or happy, or both. So literally it says it is not true that she is either wealthy or happy. Okay? Another way of saying it is she is neither wealthy nor happy. We'll get to that. Why is it that way? We'll get to that in a moment. So now, let's look at these symbolic statements. So we want to express things with parentheses. In a lot of cases, parentheses make a big difference because these parentheses group these compound statements together. Okay, so it's this thing implies this. But if we put the parentheses around here, it's going to be different. Okay, so statements that go together are here, these two go together, and then here it's these two to go together. Okay, so here it says if Q and not P, then not R. So if this is true, then, so this whole thing implies not R. So if Q and not P, then not R. See the comma? Okay. Now, look at here. These are grouped together. Now, where does the comma go? Right there. Q and if not P, then not R. Okay. So notice that the comma helps you in a manner of speaking. Okay. Notice that when we translate the symbolic statements into English, the simplest statements in parentheses appear on the side, on the same side of the comma. Okay. The simple statements in parentheses appear on the same side of the comma. Okay, now, what about this statement here? So now we have P, Q, and R represent the following statements. So P is a student misses a lecture, Q, a student studies, R, a student fails. Now, so what does this statement mean in words, in English words? Well, Q is the student studies, and what is not P? Well, P, student misses lecture. So in this case, doesn't miss lecture. So if, what is this saying? If a student studies and does not miss lecture, then what? Then the student will not fail, or does not fail. Okay? Now what about this one? Now this is saying, now here's the parentheses, okay? The Q is the student studies. So the student studies, and if what? He doesn't miss lecture, then the student will not fail. So it says, this is saying that the student studies, and if the student doesn't miss lecture, then the student will not fail or does not fail. Okay, the student studies, comma, and if the student fails, does not miss lecture, then the student does not fail. Okay, so again, make sure you know where the comma goes. And the comma goes here too for the implication. Okay, now, if a symbolic statement appears without parentheses before and after the most dominant. So again, if a symbolic statement appears without parentheses, statements before and after the most dominant connective should be grouped. Well, how do we know about dominance? Okay, so the dominance of connectives used in symbolic logic is defined in this order. We have negation, which is the least dominant. Then we have conjunction and disjunction, which have the same level of dominance. Then we have the conditional, which is a higher level of dominance. And then the highest level, the most dominant one, is the biconditional. Okay, so we always go in level of dominance in that order. Now, here's the statement. So if we look at these statements, P implies Q and not R. Well, in this case here, the most dominant is the implication. So where it's going to be, so it tells us where the parentheses should go. The parentheses should go around this. And so this would be the correct form, and it's a conditional. Okay, so this would be a conditional statement. Here, again, the most dominant one is the implication, so these two are going to be grouped together, and it's a conditional. Now here, the biconditional is the most dominant, so we would group these two together in parentheses. Likewise here, this tells us that this is the most dominant, so these two are going to be grouped together. Now in this case here, we've got the most dominant one here, so these two and these two are going to be grouped together, and it's a conditional. Okay, now, what about these? Well, in this case here, it's ambiguous. Okay, should I put the parentheses around this one, or should I put the parentheses around this one? This is ambiguous, so we don't know. So in things like this, we just don't have enough information. We need to have parentheses, because where we put the parentheses makes a difference. So notice that if we grouped them here, it'd be a what? A disjunction. If we grouped it like this, it'd be a conjunction. Two very different things. Okay, so now we're going to use dominance and figure out how we can set this up. So let the P, Q, and R represent the following statements, right? P, I failed the course. Q, I study hard. R, I passed the final. Write each compound statement in symbolic form. So it says, I do not fail the course if and only if I study hard and I pass the final. So the if and only if part is the dominant. So it means that everything after, right, is going to be connected. So if and only if I study hard and I pass the final. So that's going to be parentheses. And so this is going to be after or before the biconditional. Here it says I do not fail the course if and only if I study hard and I pass the final. So now notice the parenthesis or the comma. Okay, here's the comma. It says I do not fail the course if and only if I study hard. So that means the if and only if is going to be grouped together in this case. Because why? Because notice that the comma tells us that everything on one side of the comma is connected together. Okay? Here I use the dominance, if and only if. Okay? Here the comma tells us what needs to be grouped. So again, if there's no comma, we go by dominance. If there's a comma, then everything on one side of the comma is grouped together. Now, it says, I do not fail the course if and only if I study hard and I pass the final. And we're going to say P is I fail the course, Q is I study hard, R is I pass the final. Okay, so again, here's the if and only if I study hard, right? And so notice that it says, I do not pass the course, not P, if and only if, biconditional, I study hard, Q, and then I pass the final. Okay, this is the dominant one, right? So because the most dominant connective appears is this, the symbolic form in parentheses is going to be what? P, and then you have Q, and this is wrong. Yeah, this would be P implies Q. Yeah, this is not correct. I think this is a typo. I don't know what they're doing here with the symbols here, but it would be not P if and only if Q. Okay, so these two would be in parentheses. So Q and R would be in parentheses, and then this would be the biconditional would be outside the parentheses, and this would be not P. So this is wrong. Don't pay any attention to that. Okay, so that ends this section. Again, please, 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 please make sure you go through these examples and you understand how to do these on your own. If you have any questions or you're confused at all, write down those questions, write down the ones that you're not sure about, Again, make sure you're doing the other examples in the textbooks too. It gives you more to practice with before you get to class, and it'll also help you with figuring out what questions you want to ask. If you get stuck on something, write it down and bring it to class, because that's where we're going to look at it. So again, very important to practice. Do the suggested homework problems. If you get stuck on those, bring those to class and ask about those. We'll work through them in class. Other than that, until next time, have a great day, and we'll see you in class. Bye-bye.